I've been a nurse for nearly 12 years now, and you see enough human fragility in hospitals that you think nothing can really surprise you anymore. Bodies stop working. Families cry. It's a clinical, predictable cycle. But before I transitioned to ICU nursing, back when I was 26 and trying to pay off my accelerated BSN program, I took a job at a mortuary in Washington, located right on the grounds adjacent to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. It paid better than the local clinic, and the quiet gave me hours to study. The mortuary was a modest, modern building tucked near the hospital's back service road, surrounded by an asphalt parking lot under harsh overhead streetlights. My coworker, Sarah, a seasoned mortician who had been with the parlor for a decade, was usually the one handling the heavy prep work in the embalming room down the hall, while I sat at the front desk handling paperwork, filing death certificates, and reviewing my pharmacology flashcards. The incident happened on a Thursday night in late November. We had a single decedent in the cooler, an 84-year-old woman named Martha who had passed away peacefully at a nearby hospice. Her husband had come in earlier that afternoon to finalize the arrangements. He was an older man, stooped and quiet, clutching a worn leather coat. Before he left, he had made a specific request to Sarah, his voice breaking slightly. He wanted Martha buried wearing her wedding band. He explained that in 62 years of marriage, she had never taken it off once, not to cook, not to garden, not even when her hands swelled up with arthritis in her final years. It was a thick, heavy band of old yellow gold, deeply embedded in the skin of her left ring finger. Around 2 a.m., Sarah went into the preparation room to finish the final dressing and cosmetic work for the morning viewing. I stayed at the front desk, the steady hum of the central air system providing a dull background hum against the quiet stillness outside. About 20 minutes later, I heard a sharp, plastic clatter echoing down the narrow hallway, followed by a muffled gasp. I didn't think twice. I stood up, walked down the corridor, and pushed open the heavy swinging door to the prep room. Sarah was standing frozen by the stainless steel wash table. The room was cold, smelling faintly of formaldehyde, harsh disinfectant, and clinical antiseptic. On the counter near the sink sat a collection of stray items for the viewing: a hairbrush, a bottle of setting lotion, and several beige styrofoam mannequin heads used for styling wigs. One of those lightweight styrofoam heads was now lying on the far side of the room, near the supply cabinets, as if it had been thrown with considerable force. Sarah was staring at the empty wash table, her face entirely drained of color. Her hands were shaking. "Did something fall?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sterile room. Sarah didn't look at me right away. She slowly turned her gaze toward Martha's body on the table. The elderly woman's left hand rested limply on the stainless steel, and the skin around her knuckle was reddened. "I was just trying to follow protocol," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the overhead lights. Her finger was swollen. I couldn't get the paperwork accurate for the inventory list without noting the exact weight and hallmarks of the band. I slid it off her finger just for a second to log the serial number. As soon as she said it, the tension in the room felt thick and suffocating, like the air right before a summer thunderstorm. Sarah swallowed hard, looking directly at the corpse. Then, without a shred of irony or hesitation, she raised her voice, speaking clearly into the empty space of the room. All right, Sarah said, her tone flat and entirely matter-of-fact. "I'm sorry. I'll put your ring back on." She picked up the heavy gold band, slid it back over the stiff knuckle of Martha's left hand, and pushed it down until it settled firmly against the skin where it had lived for decades. Instantly, the heavy, oppressive pressure in the room vanished. The overhead lights stopped their faint, irritating flicker. Nothing else moved for the rest of the night. We finished our shifts in silence, and I never took a shift in the prep room again. I've worked as a certified nursing aide at Whispering Pines Care Center in Hartford, Connecticut, for 6 years now. It's a modest, family-run facility housed in a building that dates back to the early 1900s. Long before it was converted into a nursing home, The brick structure operated as a county orphanage. The current owners didn't try to hide its history when I was hired. In fact, the director, Martha, was upfront about it during my orientation. She told us that the orphanage had been shut down in the late 1950s following investigations into severe neglect and institutional abuse. It wasn't local gossip or urban legend. Martha had the old county records locked in her office file cabinet, detailing a dark chapter of children left cold, underfed, and forgotten within these very walls. Over the years, the building retained a certain heaviness, but you get used to it when you work night shifts and evening rounds. The creaking floorboards, the drafty windows, and the hum of the old radiator pipes just become part of the background. What you never truly get used to, however, is what happens when our residents reach their final days. It started innocently enough during my third year. We had a patient named Arthur, an 84-year-old retired machinist who was fiercely independent, sharp as a tack, and completely oriented to time and place. Arthur knew every nurse aide's schedule, joked with us about the cafeteria food, and loved doing crossword puzzles in the day room. There was nothing medically cognitive or psychiatric to suggest he was losing his grip on reality. One evening around 6 p.m., I was pushing the dinner cart down the long, linoleum-floored west wing, handing out meal trays. When I reached Arthur's private room, the door was half open. I stopped and looked inside. Arthur was sitting upright in his armchair, but his back was turned entirely away from the doorway, facing the far corner near the closet. He wasn't watching television or looking out the window. Instead, he was chuckling softly, speaking in a warm, conversational tone as though someone was sitting right across from him. I gave a light knock on the wooden door frame and stepped in. "Arthur? Dinner's here, buddy. Chicken pot pie tonight." He didn't turn around immediately. He gave another low chuckle, waved a wrinkled hand toward the empty corner, and said, "Hold on just a second, sweetheart." He finally glanced over his shoulder at me, his eyes bright and completely clear. I smiled, though a strange, cold prickle danced down the back of my neck. "Who are you talking to, Arthur?" He grinned, shaking his head. "This little girl came into my room. She was scared. Said she couldn't find her way back down the hall." I looked over at the corner he was gesturing toward. There was nothing there, just a small wooden nightstand, an empty coat rack, and the cream-colored wall casting a shadow under the overhead light. My stomach tightened, but I forced a reassuring smile, assuming it was a fleeting hallucination or the beginning of terminal delirium. I placed his tray on the rolling table and coaxed him back to bed. Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days later. At the time, I brushed it off. Working in elder care exposes you to strange phenomena. Medications, oxygen deprivation, and failing organs can cause vivid end-of-life visions. But 6 months later, the pattern shifted from unsettling to terrifying. We had a new resident named Mr. Henderson. Unlike Arthur, Mr. Henderson was easily agitated, but he was still alert enough to recognize us and communicate his needs clearly. One rainy Tuesday night around 2 a.m., his emergency call light chimed violently from room 214. My coworker Sarah and I both rushed down the hall, jogging over the worn industrial carpet. When we pushed the door open, Mr. Henderson was sitting straight up in his hospital bed, thrashing violently beneath the sheets. His face was slick with cold sweat, and his eyes were wide with unadulterated terror. He was kicking his legs furiously, trying to scramble up toward the headboard. Get off me," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "She's grabbing my feet. Tell her to leave me alone. Get her out of here." Sarah immediately rushed to his side, flicking on the bright overhead light, while I checked his vitals and tried to calm him down. "Mr. Henderson, look at me. You're safe. There's nothing on your bed," I said firmly, grabbing his shaking hands. He ignored us completely, staring fixedly at the foot of his bed, sobbing as he tried to kick whatever was pinning his ankles down. "She's right there. She won't let go. She's ice cold," he shrieked, clawing at the mattress edges before collapsing back against the pillows, gasping for air. We called the nurse on duty, administered his prescribed anxiety medication, and stayed with him until his breathing finally leveled out into a ragged, shallow rhythm. Neither Sarah nor I spoke as we walked back to the nursing station. We both knew. Mr. Henderson died quietly before dawn that same night. Over my 6 years at Whispering Pines, it has happened 4 more times. Different residents, different rooms, but the exact same sequence. They become lucid. They spot a scared little girl standing in the corner or touching their bed. And within days, sometimes hours, their hearts simply stop beating. What haunts me the most isn't just the sheer consistency of these encounters, or the fact that older, veteran aides on the day shift share the exact same stories in hushed tones during lunch breaks. It's the quiet realization whenever I walk down that hallway at night. Whenever a resident casually mentions a child wandering the corridors, looking lost or scared, a heavy dread settles into my chest. We keep taking care of them. We keep passing out the dinner trays, and we smile through the tension, but deep down, we are all just waiting to see who she comes back for next. I was 24 years old when I took the night shift as a certified nursing assistant at Maple Ridge Senior Living. It was a pretty relaxing gig, all things considered. The pay was decent, the facility was modern, and most of the residents slept through the night. My duties during the night shift, running from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., mostly consisted of checking in on people every hour, answering the occasional call light, helping the toilet people to the bathroom, and passing out early morning medications around 4:30. I usually worked with one other aide, a woman named Brenda who had been at Maple Ridge for over a decade. Brenda stayed on the first and second floors, while I took the third and fourth. The fourth floor was mostly memory care, housing residents with varying stages of dementia and Alzheimer's. It was a Friday night in late November, right around 3:15 a.m. The facility was dead quiet, save for the distant, electronic beep of a medication cart somewhere down on floor 2. I was sitting at the fourth floor nurse's station, sipping lukewarm coffee from a ceramic mug and scrolling through articles on my phone to stay awake, when my walkie-talkie crackled to life. Brenda's voice came through, staticky and low. "Hey, are you up on 4? Someone's raising hell in the north wing." Sounded like a heavy thump or a door slamming. I glanced up at the wall clock hanging above the medication room. 3:17 a.m. The witching hour. Someone was probably sundowning, waking up disoriented in the dark and confused about where they were. It happened all the time. "Yeah, I copy." I spoke into the radio, clipping it back onto my scrubs. "I'll go check it out." Probably just Mr. Abernathy trying to escape again. I stood up, stretching my legs, and walked down the dim hallway toward the elevators. The lighting on the fourth floor at night was kept at a low, amber glow to avoid overstimulating the residents, casting long, wavering shadows against the pale floral wallpaper. I pressed the call button, and the elevator doors slid open immediately. I stepped inside and punched the button for the fourth floor. Wait, no, I was already on the fourth floor. I pressed the button for the second floor out of pure muscle memory, caught myself, and quickly hit the fourth floor button again, letting out a quiet sigh of self-deprecation. As the elevator doors closed and began their slow, mechanical ascent, the ambient noise of the building shifted. That was when I first heard it. At first, it sounded like muffled thumping, like someone dropping a heavy book on a carpeted floor. But as the car passed the second floor, the sound sharpened into a frantic, violent banging, accompanied by a scraping noise that set my teeth on edge. By the time the elevator neared the fourth floor, it was unmistakably a high-pitched, rhythmic screeching metal scraping against drywall. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors glided open. I stepped out into the north wing corridor, and the noise hit me like a physical wave. Standing about 30 feet away was Clara. Clara was a resident on the memory care unit, a woman who couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds. Fragile and stooped with a severe curvature of her spine, who had just celebrated her 100th birthday the month before. Right now, however, she looked possessed by a terrifying, unnatural strength. She was thrashing her heavy metal-framed walker back and forth, slamming it repeatedly against the wooden baseboards, leaving white gouges in the paint. At the same time, she was making the most ear-piercing, ungodly banshee wailing sounds I had ever heard come out of a human being. It wasn't words. It was a raw, rattling shriek that seemed to vibrate straight through the floorboards. "Clara, hey, Clara," I called out, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs. I hurried down the hallway toward her, keeping my voice low and soothing. "It's okay. You're okay. Let's get you back to bed." I approached her slowly, hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. She didn't look at me. Her cloudy, cataract-veiled eyes were fixed straight ahead, staring wildly into the empty hallway as she kept up the chaotic rhythm, slamming the walker and howling at the top of her lungs. I reached out and very gently placed a hand on her frail forearm, starting to guide and redirect her toward her apartment, which was just a few doors down. The entire time, she was flailing her arms and howling, dead weight fighting against my gentle pulls. We made it about halfway down the hallway. The fluorescent light overhead flickered once, casting a brief, sickly shadow over the carpet. And then, instantly, dead silence. The shrieking cut off mid-breath. The heavy metal walker stopped moving against the wall. I froze, my hand still gripping her thin arm through her cardigan. For a terrifying second, I thought she might have gone into cardiac arrest or suffered a stroke from the sheer exertion. Clara slowly stopped thrashing. Her head, covered in sparse, paper-thin white hair, jerked around with unnatural speed. She turned her face upward to look directly at me. Her mouth remained clamped shut in a thin, rigid line, but her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely void of the usual milky confusion. She raised a shaking, bony finger, trembling violently, and pointed it past my shoulder into the empty hallway behind me. In a voice that sounded dry, flat, and entirely unlike her own, she whispered, "There's a man behind you." The blood completely drained from my face, and a cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. My stomach dropped into a sickening freefall. Every primal instinct I had screamed that I was no longer alone in that hallway. Without turning around to look, because I knew, with absolute, paralyzing certainty, that if I turned my head, I would see something I was never meant to see, I completely lost my composure. I literally shit my pants right there in my scrubs, a hot wave of humiliation and sheer, unadulterated terror hitting me simultaneously. Adrenaline overrode every rational thought in my brain. I grabbed Clara, essentially scooping her 70-pound frame up into my arms like a sack of laundry, and sprinted down the remaining length of the hallway. She instantly resumed her frantic flailing and screeching, howling bloody murder in my ear as I half-carried, half-dragged her into her apartment, kicking the door shut behind us with my foot and throwing the deadbolt. My chest was heaving, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate. I rushed her straight into the bathroom, stripped off her soiled nightgown, cleaned her up with trembling hands, and practically threw her into her bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. All of this happened in a breathless, frantic blur of pure panic. Once she was tucked in, she curled into a tight ball, muttering incoherently to herself, her episode seemingly burnt out as fast as it had started. I locked myself in her private bathroom, leaning against the sink with my eyes squeezed shut, trying to regulate my breathing while tears of shock prickled behind my eyelids. I spent the next 20 minutes scrubbing myself up, changing into a spare pair of scrubs I kept in my locker, and trying to convince myself it was just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and a sundowning dementia patient. I never went back out into that hallway alone for the rest of the shift. When Brenda came up to relieve me at 6 a.m., she asked why I looked so pale and why I was sitting rigidly inside the nurse's station with all the lights turned on. I just told her I had a bad stomach bug. She didn't ask any more questions, and I never told a single soul what Clara pointed at in the dark.